feature in this week's Torah portion, Parashat Beha'alotecha. 2 verses in Numbers, chapter 10, are enclosed within 2 letters. The first letter, an isolated nun, known as Nun Menuzeret, and the second, an inverted nun, known as Nun Hafucha. And on the slide, you can see what it looks like within the scroll. And you can see those 2 hanging nuns, one the right way up and the second one inverted. The rabbis offered 2 explanations for this curiosity in the Torah. In the Midrash, Rabbi Judah the Prince says, these 2 verses are marked at the beginning and at the end to show that this is not their proper place. They're marked to indicate that they form a separate book, a short book of just 2 verses, but a discrete book nonetheless. The Talmud offers an explanation in the name of Rav Ashi, who says that these verses are out of order. Their proper place should come earlier in Numbers, in the passage on Degalim, the military banners, or more precisely, the military units or divisions, a description of the Israelite troops. Rabbi Judah the Prince's claim that these 2 verses form a separate book is supported by the Mishnah. A biblical scroll, says the Mishnah, that contains 85 letters, as in this section that begins when the ark was to set out, defiles the hands, an expression that means, it's a little counterintuitive, that a book is considered sacred, part of the canonized Hebrew Bible. It's an idiom that if there's a book in the Torah that defiles the hands, it means that it's part of the canon of Torah. It's sacred, it's holy. I will come to the meaning of these verses, but staying with the 2 nuns for the moment, there's a medieval tradition in an 11th century manuscript from Cairo that these verses are an excerpt from a source known as the prophecy of Eldad and Medad. Now, Eldad and Medad were 2 men who are mentioned in the following chapter of our Torah portion. And they occur in this context. Following the appointment of 70 elders to assist Moses and a ceremony during which God draws on the spirit of Moses and places it on the elders, 2 men remain in the camp, the spirit resting on them, and they're described as speaking in ecstasy, mitnabe. A young man runs out to report to Moses that these 2 men are acting the prophet in the camp. How dare they? And Joshua urges Moses to restrain them, but Moses refuses. Are you wrought up on my account, he says? Would that all God's people were prophets, and that God had put his spirit upon them. The commentaries to this particular story suggest that Eldad and Medad were challenging Moses' authority, but there's also something else going on here. This so-called book of 2 verses was suppressed or hidden because it represented, says Jacob Milgrom, a rare medieval instance of the denial of Mosaic authorship to a part of the Torah. Not quite heresy, but a challenge nevertheless. So what do these verses actually say? They occur in a passage recording the 3-day journey from Sinai to the next resting place, the Ark of the Covenant traveling in front of them, and the cloud of God above them by day. And here is how the verses continue. When the ark was to set out, Moses would say, Kuma, Adonai, advance, O Eternal One. May your enemies be scattered, and may your foes flee before you. And when it halted, he would say, Shuva, Adonai, return, O Eternal One, you who are Israel's myriads of thousands. It is perhaps significant that the first verse of this couplet is repeated almost verbatim in Psalm 68, verse 2, and both verses condensed in Psalm 132, verse 8. And why that's significant is because it suggests that this verse was a familiar refrain. If you like, a liturgy, it suggests a familiar refrain, if you like, a liturgy that accompanied not only the Ark of the Covenant as it was carried from one resting place to another in the desert, but a battle song that would be chanted in times of war. Until the Ark of the Covenant came to find a permanent resting place in Solomon's temple, it's clear from the books of Samuel and Kings that the Ark was a kind of war mascot. The book of Samuel records its capture by the Philistines and celebration of its return by David when it was recaptured. In these two verses, we see the ark ready to precede troops in their march to war. Kuma Adonai, advance, O Eternal One, or arise, O Eternal One. Here the ark, in which rested the tablets of the covenant, with the commandments engraved on them, becomes an image of God's chariot throne, the verb signifying advancing or rising to attack an opposing army. This is a prayer, if you like, for Israel, led by God to succeed in battle. And similarly, the second verse becomes a supplication, Shuva Adonai, for the safe return of the troops from war, and an allusion, says the Midrash, to God who rules above with thousands of celestial hosts, and who also rules below with his thousands of myriads. In sum, then, Jewish tradition sees these two verses as a separate book that has been incorporated into the Hebrew Bible. It sees these verses as a refrain sung by Moses as the Ark of the Covenant was taken up and carried on each stage of the Israelites' journey through the wilderness, and later on as a battle cry sung by the Israelites as they went to war, with the ark as their advance guard. But there is one other quite troubling oddity about these two verses. They occur in the liturgy that surrounds the removal of the Torah from the ark. They have been removed from liberal Siddurim and Machzorim, but if you go into any other slightly more traditional synagogue and find yourself standing as the ark is opened, these two verses will be sung as the Torah is removed from the ark. Now, in the earliest rabbinic sources of the Mishnah and Talmud, there are no special prayers surrounding the removal of the scroll from the ark and the reading of the Torah. It's only in later sources from the 9th century onwards that there begins to be a ritual surrounding this part of the service, and it's given through various verses a certain pomp and majesty. And there are no sources earlier than the middle of the 13th century that attest to the use of this song in the Torah service, verses that may have been influenced by David's ceremonial bringing of the Ark of God to Jerusalem in 2 Samuel chapter 6. Ismar Elbogans monumental history of the Jewish liturgy says that the custom of including these specific verses has been universal in Ashkenaz, in the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, only since the middle of the 16th century. So that is very late in terms of our liturgy. There's much more to be said about these verses and their critical position in the Torah service at the very moment when we take out the scroll and are about to read from it. Liberal Judaism early on perceived the painful dissonance between their battle cry, invoking God as general of the army who would lead the Israelites out to battle, defeating their enemies before them, bringing home the troops safely, and got rid of it from our prayer book. I had wanted this sermon to focus on the character of Miriam, who features at the end of this week's parashah, in an episode which I find one of the most painful in the Torah, where she's afflicted with leprosy or some disease for speaking against Moses' Cushite wife. But I could not ignore the news of Israel's attack on Iran and the fear of retaliation. In earlier centuries, when Jews did not have sovereign power, but were living under Christian or Islamic rule in the lands of Ashkenaz or Sepharad, such verses as these from our parashah could do little or no harm, other than perhaps articulate a Jewish longing to be free from oppression and exile, but to retain a view that sees Israel's foes as God's enemies and that allows a vocabulary of enmity and war to intrude into a moment of sacred learning and reverence, shaping our worldview into a theology of conflict, power, and supremacy, seems irresponsible and dangerous. In its biblical context, it stands for one thing, but in our daily and Shabbat liturgy, its immediacy should make us fearful. It should not embolden us. Wherever we stand on this now regional war, a war that will endanger the citizens of the State of Israel and Palestine because their territories are not 100 miles apart, let us read our text not as Kuma, advance to war, but as arise, Bakesh Shalom, seek peace, and Shuvah, return, not in a spirit of triumphalism, but as a prayer for tranquility and rest for all God's people. Amen.